Happy Thursday, guys. We are now in the next chapter of our Human Anatomy and Physiology, the online version. We're going to be starting with the anatomy of the heart. And this is very important in your studies of the lab for next week. So let's go and start off now with the heart anatomy. So the heart is the pumping organ of the cardiovascular system. It is responsible for pumping the blood to the different parts of the body. So it moves the blood. And it is a transport system that's made up of two side-by-side pumps. And these side-by-side pumps is actually only in one organ. The right side of the organ happens to be the pump that would be receiving oxygen-poor blood coming from the tissues, and then it's going to be directed out of the heart into the lungs. And in the lungs, this is now what you call the pulmonary circuit. When the blood is now in the lungs, it's going to be receiving oxygen. It moves out of the lung being oxygen rich, and it's going to be delivered via via a vein, which you call the pulmonary vein, back to the heart. On the left side of the heart, which happens to be the left pump, and is receiving oxygenated blood from the lungs, and then pumps the blood back out of the left side into the different parts of the body, which is actually the systemic circuit. So there are three circuits that you have that goes around the heart. The first circuit is what you call the systemic circuit. This is actually the circuit that moves blood from the tissues to the heart, and then from the heart back again to the tissues. The next circuit is what you call the pulmonary circuit. The pulmonary circuit brings blood, which is oxygen poor, from the heart, that's coming from the tissues, and delivers it to the lungs. And then there is going to pick up oxygen, and from the lungs, it's going to go back to the left side of the heart. Now, there is a third one, which you call the coronary circuit. The coronary circuit is actually the actual going around and circulation of blood on the heart itself. The heart is a pumping organ. It is the one that receives blood from the tissues and delivers blood back to the tissues. Therefore, it is a highly working organ and deserves to be having a portion of the circulating blood all to herself, just to make sure that she is also feeding her muscles. The heart is actually made up of pure muscles, so it would need a lot of blood in order to nourish itself. So that's actually what's actually us doing the circulation around the heart, the coronary circuit. So here's actually in a nutshell how the systemic circuit, the circuit goes around the heart. And we're going to go through the entire circulation, naming all the different parts of the heart as we move along. So the receiving chambers of the heart, you have 4 chambers. And the chambers will be 2 upper chambers, which you call the atria, and the 2 lower chambers, which you call the ventricles. The receiving chambers of the heart is actually coming from the systemic circuit. It is now going to be received by the right atrium. The right atrium receives blood that's returning from the tissues, and then the other receiving part is actually this section right here, which you call the left atrium. Left atrium receives blood coming from the pulmonary circuit. Therefore, between the two, the right atrium is actually carrying blood that is oxygen poor. The left atrium is carrying blood that is oxygen rich. Then the pumping chambers. The pumping chambers are surrounded by very thick muscles. You can see as it receives blood, it is now going to get ready to squeeze and move the blood that it has just received. So blood moves from the right atrium into the left ventricle, from the left, from the right atrium to the right ventricle, then from the left atrium into the left ventricle. Once the left ventricle has filled up, the the muscles, the heavy muscles that you see here, will contract and will push the blood that it has received from the atria into the big arteries. In your right ventricle, the blood is going to be pushed into the uh, pulmonary trunk and into the lungs. And then from your, from the left ventricle, the heart is going to be pushed, the blood is actually going to be pushed out into the aorta, from the ascending aorta into the aortic arch, into the descending aorta, and into the thoracic aorta, back into the different tissues. So there are four chambers. You have your two upper atria and two lower ventricles, which are actually the pumping chambers. So where do you find the heart? Well, the heart is found in the middle of your chest, in an area which you call the mediastinum. So the mediastinum is right around this area here, in the middle of the sternum. This is actually your chest, your breastbone, and in the middle of that, under that, there's actually a soft tissue which you call the heart, and it's being protected by the rib cage as well as the breastbone. Now, the heart is about only a pound. Okay, depending on what your size is, it could probably fluctuate plus or minus 1 or 2 ounces or something, but it's not really that big. It's only almost like the size of a fist. It is right there in the middle of the chest, in an area which you call the mediastinum, and it is actually between the second rib and the fifth intercostal space on the superior surface of the diaphragm. Now, 2/3 of the heart is actually like situated a little bit to the left of the mediasternal line. Now, it is located also anterior to the vertebral column and posterior to the sternum. So here is a cross section of the entire body, showing right at the portion where you have the lungs and within the mediastinum, showing the heart. Also another transverse section of the heart. So you have some basic orientation and location in some parts of the heart. The base of the heart is the posterior surface. You call that the posterior surface. The base leans towards the right shoulder. The apex of the heart is that pointy posterior end of the heart, and it points towards the left hip. The apical impulse is actually palpated between the fifth and the sixth ribs, just below the nipple. It's actually called apical impulse because when you feel it right there, it would have a very fine pulse. Now, the heart is covered by dense regular connective tissue, more like a plastic, transparent plastic that goes around it. And you call this the pericardium. The pericardium is double-walled sac. It surrounds the heart, and it's made up of 2 layers. The first layer is what you call an outer portion, superficial fibrous pericardium, and the function of this is to protect and anchor the heart to surrounding tissues. Then it will have a deep 2-layered serous pericardium, and the serous pericardium has 2 layers like what I mentioned. The first layer is called the parietal layer. This parietal layer lines the internal surface of both the fibrous pericardium. Okay, and then the visceral layer, which you call the epicardium, is the one that is closely knitted on the external surface of the heart muscle itself. And these 2 layers are separated from each other by a fluid-filled pericardial cavity. The pericardial cavity must be filled with a fluid that is rich in hyaluronic acid, that makes it really very slimy. This very slimy fluid is going to prevent the surface of the heart and the surface, the parietal and visceral layer of the pericardium, it will be prevented from rubbing onto each other and being injured by the rubbing. And here you go, guys. This is a closer look just to show you the different covers of the heart. This is your pericardium, and the pericardium has two layers. You have the outer layer to be fibrous pericardium and an inner layer that is really a parietal layer, which is a serous pericardium. This is very flimsy, and this is really very pretty much like uh, it may look like it is like what call this a thick opaque saran wrap, this particular pericardium, but in reality it looks that way only because probably you're looking at an old heart. But looking at a young heart, the the pericardium should be more flexible, and it would be in good health. So in between your fibrous pericardium, in between your pericardium itself and the heart muscle, you have a space. That space is pericardial cavity and is filled with hyaluronic acid. Then on the heart muscle itself, you have the serous layer of the pericardium to be um, to be covering it, and therefore you know that this is just a serous layer. Therefore, it's going to be very, very, very fine. So in our homeostasis, in our study of um, physiology, pericarditis is a homeostatic imbalance that is brought about by inflammation of the pericardium. The pericardium is actually the connective tissue cover of the heart. Now, what it does is that it roughens the membrane surfaces, causing what you call pericardial or otherwise known as a pericardial friction rub or creaking sound, and is heard with a stethoscope. Now, lamponade is another lamponade is another uh, um, homeostatic imbalance, which is brought about by pericarditis. Cardiac tamponade is actually excess fluid that leaks into the pericardial space because of that inflammation. Now, because of this tamponade, the heart is compressed and its pumping ability is actually diminished. Usually, in this case, that particular fluid must be drawn out of the cavity, and that's pretty much usually the person is going to be given massive doses of antibiotics, and it is actually led to heal. So let's take a look at the three layers of the heart. Three layers of the heart. You have a visceral layer, which is the epicardium. This is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. This is the one that's closely kneaded to the heart muscle. Then you have the heart muscle itself. You call it the myocardium. This is your myocardium right there. The circular or spiritual bundles of contractile muscle fiber. This is actually what makes up the myocardium or the heart muscle itself. You have together in the mitochondrium, okay, it's actually what makes it up is actually a whole chunk of cardiac skeleton, which is really nothing but crisscrossing and interlacing of connective tissue over the muscle. It anchors cardiac muscle fibers. It supports great vessels and valves, and it limits the spread of action potential to specific pathways other than that which is actually what the heart muscles are all about. Okay, this is the interlacing muscle fibers. It's just a little bit of an explanation is exactly what that particular thing is all about. The endocardium is the innermost layer and is continuous with the endothelial lining of the blood. This lines the heart chambers and covers the cardiac skeleton of the valves. There you go, guys. This is the endocardium. The endocardium is the inner lining of the heart muscle fiber, right? So let's take a look at the chambers of the heart that is associated with the great blood vessels, the blood vessels that would either deliver blood back into the heart, or are they going to be the ones that is responsible for picking up the lungs? Okay, so the great chambers, pretty much you will have total of four chambers, two superior chambers, which you call the atria, two inferior chambers, which you call the ventricles. Okay, the receiving chambers are your atria, and the pumping chambers are what you call the ventricles. Now, between the two atria, there's actually what you call the interatrial septum, and this is actually separating the atria. And then the interventricular septum are quite big, bigger than the interatrial septum. And it's because this is the pumping chamber of the heart. Here you go, guys. The four chambers will be um, the upper atrium, the lower ventricles, and then in between the atrium you have the interventricular septum, and between the arteries you have still the big arteries here. Big arteries are all big arteries, which means how big can they be? Well, they're just as big as that. And uh, the big arteries are the ones that are responsible for carrying blood uh, away from the heart towards the organs. All arteries are like that, with the exception of uh, the uh, well, no, I stand corrected. Arteries are, yeah, away from the heart. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood towards the heart. Okay, so that's the difference between the two blood vessels. And what about the capillaries? Capillaries are actually blood vessels that would pretty much connect the arterial, the baby arteries, and the veneal, or the baby veins. So blood moves into the tissues via the arteries, and then it goes into the capillaries, and then it goes back into the venules. All right. So, well, guys, the coronary sulcus is just it's not imaginary, it's real, it's right there. It's a sulcus, it's a canal, it's a groove that would pretty much like, kind of like a separate on the outside. It separates the two ventricles. You will see it outside, and it's filled with blood vessels and really a chunk of fat. That's why you see the coronary sulcus to be loaded with fat, and you cannot see the canal because of the fat. Now there are two sulci, and these one here, the anterior interventricular sulcus, runs alongside the anterior wall of the heart, and the posterior interventricular sulcus is a landmark. That's a canal that runs on the backside of the heart. This is the anterior interventricular sulcus, which is kind of different from the posterior. The anterior interventricular sulcus runs diagonally, okay, whereas the posterior sulcus runs straight down. Okay, so let's take a look at closely at the chambers and those great blood vessels that are associated with the chambers of the heart. The atria are the receiving chambers. They're very thin walled. They contribute very little to the propulsion of blood. All right. You call them sometimes as auricles. Auricles meaning ear, because when you look at them outside, the outer wall of the atria is the chamber. The auricle is actually the wall that surrounds the atria, and they look like, outside you look at them, they look like ears of mice. Therefore, you call them auricles. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the heart, and this is where you will find the superior vena cava emptying blood. So the superior vena cava is connected to the right atrium. Let me show you the right atrium right there. And I told you that the superior vena cava is connected to this. So blood empties from the superior vena cava into the right atrium. You even have the inferior vena cava emptying also into the right atrium. So both the superior and inferior vena cava and all of its tributaries, and this pulmonary artery um, is not connected to, remember that it's not connected to the superior vena cava. It appears to be, but it's actually only running. Where is the pulmonary artery going to? It's actually connected to this, the pulmonary trunk. All right. So the superior vena cava, let me go back to the superior vena cava, and all of its tributaries would be delivering blood back to the heart through the right atrium. Okay, then you have your ventricles. So the ventricles are the discharging chambers. Most of the volume of the heart is actually the ventricle. The right ventricle is pretty much most of the anterior surface, and the left ventricle is like kind of like geared towards the posterior surface. And you have inside the ventricle the some identifying markers inside the what do you call this, inside the ventricle itself is actually what you call the trabecula carneae. These are irregular ridges of muscles on the ventricular walls. And then you also have papillary muscles. These are finger-like projections that project into the ventricular cavity, right? And just to take note, the papillary muscles are anchored by the chorda tendinae to the heart valves. Let me show you what it is. Let me see there. These are your heart valves, and that is your papillary muscles. These are the finger-like projections. The finger-like projections are connecting the valves to the papillary muscle are, the connections of the papillary muscle connects the papillary muscle to the valve. And this connection is this connective tissue fiber right here, which you call the chorda tendinae. You have chorda tendinae that connects both valves, the right and the left AV valves, to the heart muscle. Why do you need that? Well, you need that connection. You need that chorda tendinae that connects the heart muscle to the valve itself, because whenever the heart pumps and the blood in the ventricle is ready to be ejected and the ventricle pumps, you create a big pressure inside the ventricle. And if nothing is going to hold down this valve, as soon as this ventricle contracts, is going to be pushed back into the atrium. When it's pushed back into the atrium, and nothing is going to hold it down, then all of the blood inside the ventricle goes back to the atrium. So in order to prevent that, this particular valve, whenever the ventricle contracts, it will pretty much like form like a balloon or a stopper. It stops the blood because this is an opening. And the only reason why blood does not go back into its original position is because when the ventricle contracts, it will push the valves to form a balloon that shuts down the hole, the AV hole. All right. The same thing is happening also in the right valve. The valve on the right side of the heart is called the tricuspid valve. The valve on the left side of the heart is what you call the mitral or the bicuspid valve. Both valves should have the chorda tendinae, and the chorda tendinae connects to the papillary muscles. So that when the papillary muscles contract, it's going to pull down the chorda tendinae that's going to hold on to the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve, preventing the valve, which is really, really flimsy connective tissue, from flipping back. You don't want the valve to flip back because then all of the blood goes back to the atrium. Okay. Mentioned that already. So your ventricles are thicker than the atria, because when they contract, they are actually the ones that would uh, squeeze out the blood and would push them into the big arteries. Okay, the right ventricle would pump blood into the pulmonary trunk or the pulmonary artery. The left ventricle will pump the blood into the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. Okay, so this is exactly how a human cadaver heart would look like. There you go. These are the different views of it. And this is showing you the front part of the heart. The interventricular septum is actually filled with blood vessels. They remove the fat of this. It is very, very nicely dissected heart, showing you the different coronary blood vessels that feeds the human heart muscles. So the heart valves would make sure that there is unidirectional flow of blood to the heart. So blood does not go back to the atria whenever they have been emptied into the ventricles. They open and close in response to pressure changes. And there are two main types of valves. One is what you call the SA valves, the atrioventricular valves. They're located between the atria and the ventricles. These will be your what? Your tricuspid and your bicuspid. And then your semilunar valves are located between the ventricles and the major arteries. So let's go back to the picture right there. This is a better picture of the AV valve. In this picture right here, you have an AV valve. This is the atrium and this is the ventricle. You know this is the ventricle because you can see the papillary muscle. This is just a very flimsy connective tissue that is between the atrium and the ventricles itself. They are held down by chorda tendineae. When there's a buildup of blood in this section here, then this would pretty much like form a balloon. It will balloon up and it will plug that particular opening right there. Okay. Same thing is true that would happen in both the bicuspid and tricuspid valve. There you go. This is your ventricle. When the ventricular pressure gets to be bigger here, then this will close. And when as it is closing, the chorda tendineae holds these flaps down. And as it is being held down, the blood pushes the flaps up, ballooning together. And that ballooning effect is going to keep that opening closed. That's exactly how the valve would close. Now, in prolapse of the valve, as in the mitral valve prolapse, this particular valve would be so loose that it is not capable of ballooning perfectly in order to seal that opening. And therefore, right in between, somewhere, because it is loose, there's going to be blood that's going to be squirting back into the atrium. And when doctors will auscultate, they will hear some sort of like a dripping faucet sound, and that's what you call a heart murmur. Heart murmurs are brought about by the dripping back or the backflow of blood through a defective valve back into the atrium. Okay. So the semilunar valves. What are semilunar valves? Well, semilunar valves are valves that are going to guard the opening into the big arteries. They prevent backflow from the major arteries back into the ventricles. Now, there are two semilunar valves. The one that protects or guards the pulmonary artery is your pulmonary semilunar valve, and the one that protects or guards the aorta is what's called the aortic semilunar valve. So, here you go, guys. Your blood from the artery now, as soon as it is being emptied into the ventricle by coming from the atria, now blood is in here, and when the ventricles contract, this AV valve here is now going to be closed. Blood is not anymore going to go back to the atrium. So when both AV valves are closed, then blood will not have anywhere else to go except right through the big arteries. But there is a valve into the big arteries. Those valves are what you call the semilunar valves, right? Now, the semilunar valves, once they open up, they allow blood to go through. How will the semilunar valves open up, guys? Well, they open up through the force of contraction of the ventricle. When the ventricular walls contract much forcefully than the closing force of the semilunar valves, then they will open the valves. What do you mean by closing force? Well, guys, I'm just telling you in reality, in a real heart, these valves are closed. The blood, this is filled with blood, and then it is supposedly going to push the blood into the big arteries. But these big arteries are not empty. They are not empty. They are filled with blood. Therefore, when the heart is pushing blood from the ventricles into the big arteries right there, it has to push it with such a force that would enable the valves to open up and push the blood into a tube that is not empty. It is already filled with blood. Remember that these tubes are not empty. They are filled with blood, and the pump is pushing blood into a tube that's already filled with blood. So you could just imagine, it's not easy to open the semilunar valves to push blood out because there is a pre-existing force, okay, that is brought about that's actually brought about by the blood, the pre-existing blood that is inside the artery. That force that is preventing the semilunar valves from opening up is what you call the afterload. Afterload is the amount of pressure that is pre-existing in the arteries that needs to pretty much be pretty much be what do you call that, compensated. All right, it needs, which means the force of the pumping ventricle needs to be beyond or greater than the force of the pressure inside, the pre-existing pressure brought about by the blood inside the arteries. So we're going to be discussing that, and that afterload, we're going to be discussing that in another slide, okay, so you will understand it better. So in the right side of the blood, okay, this is actually your pathway of blood. Maybe you could just go around and take a look at where the blood is going to, and then to the left side of the blood. This is a good way of going through it. Just make sure that you know that the blood, well, because it's a circulation, it goes around. So where do you start? Well, for purposes of instruction, let's just start from the tissues into the superior and inferior vena cava, and then blood gets into the right atrium. From the right atrium, that's actually oxygen poor blood. Oxygen poor blood is delivered into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, oxygen poor blood is now going to be pumped into the pulmonary trunk and then into the pulmonary arteries into the lungs. And that's actually all the way, well, you could see it here. I've been pointing only to one heart, but you could see that here, you got the blood here, and then into the right atrium, then into the right ventricle, then into the pulmonary arteries. Once they are in the pulmonary arteries, they're now going to be passing through the capillaries of the lungs. Once it passes through the capillaries of the lungs, it picks up oxygen. It will leave the lungs bright red, brightly colored, in a different color now. It's now going to be bright red because of oxyhemoglobin. You remember that? Okay. So now your bright red blood, arterial blood, is now going to be delivered back into the heart. This time, via a vein, a pulmonary vein. Remember, guys, the difference between the two types of big blood vessel. Arteries deliver blood towards the organ, okay, away from the heart. The veins will deliver the blood from the organ going back to the heart. So, right, that got nothing to do. Both arteries and veins may be uh, uh, carrying oxygen poor or oxygen rich blood in it. All right, but the direction of blood flow would remain constant. The arteries would deliver blood away from the heart, the veins deliver blood towards the heart. But most arteries would carry oxygen rich blood because they carry blood away from the heart, and most of the arteries that would carry most of the blood will be the oxygen rich blood. They carry blood away from the heart. And then because most of the blood that's going to go back to the heart is actually like running through the veins, then most of the veins are actually carrying oxygen poor blood. But there are exceptions to the rule, like your pulmonary vein delivers blood back to the heart, and like just it's not like any other vein that carries oxygen poor blood because it's coming from the lungs going back to the heart. The pulmonary vein is an exception. It is carrying oxygen rich blood. In the same token, the arteries that moves blood away from the heart is away from the heart towards the tissues. Most arteries, such as your aorta, okay, your carotid arteries, most of them are carrying blood away from the heart, and they are oxygen rich, with the exception of the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries right here, this is your pulmonary artery right here. Pulmonary arteries carry oxygen poor blood. Most arteries carry oxygen rich blood. These are already the arteries, they are oxygen rich blood, with the exception of the pulmonary artery, which will carry oxygen poor blood. So let's go back to the arterial flow. So from the tissues in the what do you call this? From the tissues, it is now going to be received back to the left side of the heart as what do you call this? As uh, what do you call oxygen rich blood, and then it's going to be delivered into the it's now going to be delivered into the atria, then into the, remember that we're starting in this direction. It's now go from the lungs. It's going to go via the pulmonary veins into the left side, the left atrium, into the right atrium. It's the left atrium into the right atrium, right ventricle rather. And then when the right ventricle, I'm sorry, I am now like disoriented. We're supposed to be on the left side now, not right. So from the lungs, it's now going to be pumped back into the left atrium, and now it's on the left atrium. Left atrium contracts. It's now going to pump blood into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle, when it contracts, will push the blood into the aorta. The aorta is the main line that delivers blood systemically. All right, so this is the entire, the entire flow of blood inside the heart, which you can actually study yourself. All right. Okay, we are not. I'm not going to go this because I did discuss this already. Okay, coronary circulation, the functional blood supply to the heart muscle itself. It is so far the shortest, but not the simplest, circulation in the blood, and is delivered to the heart whenever the heart is not contracting. It is in a relaxed state. The left ventricle receives most of the coronary blood supply. So, the heart is supposed to be, let me take a look at this, okay? A heart is a pumping organ of the blood. And it is it's actually muscle. It's a hollow organ that's made up of muscle, and it works 24/7 for the rest of your life. It pumps constantly. right? Pumps around maybe 70 times per minute. It doesn't stop from the day that, we were conceived, even before we were born, up to the time we die. That's the only time that the heart will stop moving. So it's a moving organ and therefore is in constant need of nutrients and gas, oxygen, in order to produce the ATP that is necessary to generate the energy for its movement and its muscular contraction. So it has to have its own. It has to have its own share of the blood. So where is it getting the share of blood? Well, it's getting it from what's called the pulmonary arteries. Pulmonary arteries is connected to the base of the aorta. Remember that the aorta is the main distributing what it calls artery, and it's actually the first or the beginning or is the first big artery that receives blood from the heart. So the first branch of the aorta is actually the branch that would serve the heart. So it is the pumping organ and it gets the first branch of whatever it is that it's working on. It's working hard for the body, it gets a share of the blood, the first. So these are not pulmonary, but the coronary arteries. These are the right and left coronary arteries. The left coronary artery will be pretty much like serving the left side of the heart, and the right coronary artery will be serving the right side of the heart. Now, I'm going to hold you responsible for knowing what these coronary arteries are, because they are going to be in your lab exam. All right. So this is actually your left coronary artery. It branches into two circumflex arteries, and then your right coronary artery goes all the way to the left. And take note, guys, that the heart arteries or the coronary arteries are connected from the north or from the front as it goes to the back. So the back and the front. That's already the back side of the heart itself. The coronary artery is running on the back side of the heart. It goes down and it connects to the front. So whenever you have a sort of like if you by any chance will have like a blockade somewhere here and a blockade somewhere there, then the apex of the heart would not have anymore any blood flow, right? That's going to be dead. So then you will need to put something there in order to open up that particular thing in order that the blood would flow back here. However, if you have only one blockade right here, you have one blockade here, and you do not have any blockade at the back of the heart, you still would have collateral circulation, and the collateral circulation is coming from the back and is going to feed through and going up. So the apex of your heart is not going to be killed. It will be killed, or some parts of the muscles will not anymore. If your parts of the muscle will not anymore receive any blood flow, then it definitely will be necrotic. It can actually cause a heart attack, because it's now going to be ischemic. It's going to be devoid of blood flow. So those anastomosis, meaning the connection of one blood to another, is very good, most especially in the heart and in the brain, in order to protect some parts of the heart or the brain that were protected from any blockade. If there's a blockade on one side, you know that there's a collateral flow on the other side. The bad thing is, if all of the collateral circulation has already been blocked, then you really need to go and get what you call a bypass. A heart bypass is actually it's a procedure, it's a surgical procedure that's going to connect one particular blood vessel. Usually a blood vessel coming from the groin area is going to be pulled out by a doctor and is going to be put somewhere here and then connected to this area right here. That will open up, circulation of blood, and that would make sure that the apex of the heart is going to be fed. Coronary veins pretty much are the veins, are the blood vessel that would be receiving oxygen poor blood, the blood that has been used by the muscles of the heart. And it's all going to be drained into a very big vein at the back of the heart, which you call the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus empties oxygen poor blood also into the right atrium. So that hole right there opens into the right atrium. This is the back of the heart, and that is your coronary sinus. Okay? The blood from the coronary sinus empties into the same atrium where the inferior and superior vena cava will empty blood into. So there's going to be like three holes in the right atrium that would be dumping blood into the right atrium. The the inferior vena cava, the superior vena cava, and the hole that's actually, or the drain coming from the coronary sinus. So let's take a look at some homeostatic imbalance. The angina pectoris is a pain in the chest caused by some deficiency in blood that's delivered to the myocardium. Here the cells are weakened and therefore it is radiated, the effect is radiated as pain. Myocardial infarction is caused by a blockade, a prolonged coronary blockade in areas in what call this in possibly in coronary arteries, and this blockade would prevent the feeding of blood into the heart muscle and can lead into ischemia. Okay, your heart muscles are going to be devoid of nutrients and oxygen, and that could kill it. That's what you call ischemic, and it can cause heart attack. All right, so the cardiac muscle fibers. I am not going to go through and over the cardiac heart muscle fiber because we did this already in AMP1. This is just going to be again, a review. You're going to need to know how the cardiac muscles would look like. You have to know what the intercalated disc is. You would need to know what they look like. They are supposed to be branching. They are striated, okay? And therefore, they will be asked again. Whatever it is that you're going to work on in the lab, that will be again be worked on. And this is a view of the cardiac muscle. You could see that there are striations, and these are the intercalated discs. Okay. All right. We are not anymore going to do this. We did this in the lab. Therefore, I am not going to be asking you any more questions about the physiology of the cardiac muscle because we did this in the muscular system already. All right. All right. I am not going to go back to that anymore. That will pretty much like free you from all of the worries about cardiac muscle. All right. That means